Okay, we'll start, I think, right? It's 9 o'clock, and good morning, everyone. It is good afternoon for some, and also it's good evening as well. And it is, we have this wonderful company that is still joining us from around the world. And I'm still waiting for a couple of the presenters to come in. But in any case, we'll start. And so my colleague, Dr. Mina Horowitz, and I are really delighted to welcome you to our global conversation on this important and urgent topic. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to the Dean of the Collins College of Professional Studies, where this Institute for International Communication is housed. May I introduce you to Dr. Glenn Gerstner, please?
Good morning, Basilio. Can you hear me?
Yes, I see you.
All right, great. I want to welcome everybody to this conversation on communication and civility. I'm really happy that you've all taken the time to attend. I know that most of you are academics, and if you're like us, you're spending every waking hour trying to prepare for the fall semester, which is going to be what it is. It's going to be a lot of work, but we'll figure out a way to get through it. You know, I think we need this discussion today about civility more than ever, but if I could just share with you just a quick story. When I'm not doing the interim dean thing, I'm a sport management professor. And about 5 years ago, we hosted a group of sport professionals from Europe, and over lunch, and I recall this vividly, I was sitting next to the General Secretary of the Latvian Handball Federation. Right? You can't forget that because that's a one-of-a-kind position, I'm quite certain. And he just asked me, he said, so what's been the biggest change in the United States over the last 5 or 10 years? Now, this was 5 years ago, so it was probably during the Obama administration, and then goes back another 10 years. So, you know, we all know that a lack of civility did not start in November of 2016. And I blurted out, I said, a lack of civility. We can't have a discussion anymore. It always becomes an argument. No one's willing to give an inch. So with that in mind, yeah, we need to have this discussion today. We need to talk about what constitutes debate. And I really want to thank Basilio on behalf of everybody here. You all know Basilio, this is what he does. He gets people together for important issues. So I don't want to spend any more time. I'm going to turn it back to Basilio, and once again, welcome all of you to St. John's into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerstner, for your kind words. And I also want to thank in a very special way Kevin James and Christina Munch for their technical support. And they've been working at this for quite some time now to make sure everything is working out okay. Well, our global conversation today expects to highlight what makes our public conversations so corrosive, as Dean Gerstner just mentioned. So we know today's conversation will give us rich material to work with in our next rounds of this global conversation. So our presenters are from across the world and represent different ages, professions, and contexts. Our audience is also from many countries. We have roughly, at least so far, we have registered 180 some registrations. And so in the interest of time, I have requested the speakers to limit their comments to 5 minutes, which is, of course, a challenge because the topics themselves are so rich. We can go on talking for a long time on these things. But let us start with this little ways of highlighting what is it that we need to focus on. So please feel free to send your comments, your questions via chat feature, and Dr. Horowitz will collect those comments, and then at the end, she will also summarize the conversation. And if we have time, with some of those comments and questions, we'll try to address them. So today's event will be recorded and will be made available after proper editing on the Institute's website. So I don't know if my Professor Phelan is here, because I know there was problems with the storm knocking out electricity. We lost one of our speakers today because she has no electricity at her home and she cannot connect with us. So anyway, I was hoping that Professor Phelan would introduce or set up the whole thing. But nonetheless, we can continue our conversation. And I'm going to request Afla, and we're going to call the speakers by their first names. And so I'm going to call on Afla Tubamasi to please share her thoughts. She comes to us from Ghana, but she's also has a strong presence in Boston, Massachusetts, and she's deeply focused into management of elections. Talk about a topic of civility. And so, Afua, please.
All right. Thank you, Professor Montero, and good morning, everyone. I trust that all is well with you and everyone you know in this incredibly strange time. Like the Professor said, my name is Afua. I'm originally from Ghana. I moved to the US early on, so I schooled through undergraduate here. I moved to work and travel East and Southeast Asia after undergrad and came back to the US around 2013 to join the International Communication Graduate Program at St. John's University. While I studied, I held internships at Council on Foreign Relations and the United Nations, training with functions charged with communications, policy, and media relations. I've continued learning and pursuing various communications roles since graduating. I've held positions where I've executed typical communications duties like writing newsletters, conducting interviews, and leveraging social media analytics and community behavior to improve messaging. I've also approached communications from a corporate and administrative stance, and most recently, I oversaw certification and government relation at a voting system company. In this role, I led cross-functional teams through projects to gain approval for the use of the company's machines at the federal and state level. I now support the global government affairs and policy function of a gene therapy company as their business operations lead. Here, I'm responsible for ensuring the group's infrastructure and systems are practical and efficient. These roles are seemingly disconnected at first glance, but they're partly the same because their success is enabled through diplomatic engagement. Success in these roles is made possible through positive person-to-person function to broader company, or company to industry, or company to government interactions. And they all demand that the subject develop a keen sense of understanding of the environment and stakeholders for a job well done. As we all know, companies are microcosms of the broader world, and thus the public square in their own right. So in all spheres of our lives, processes and systems are legitimized by the people that serve as gatekeepers and people in general. And this is true at work, in our communities, and virtually every place society negotiates life. So in all our environments, our expectations remain the same. Decorum and civility and communication tend to yield productive outputs, and hostility does not. Accordingly, while our environment may change, the essential needs of people remain the same. Ultimately, every single person wishes to feel heard, to feel respected, to feel valued, and to feel like they matter. These traits are realized through effective communication. In reading the problem statement for this conversation, the following phrases stood out to me the most. One, the collapse of the trust in civil society has exacerbated corporate trust with enormous geopolitical consequences. This is not new. There are ample accounts of parliament members from Taiwan to Turkey to Ukraine to the UK insulting one another and breaking into physical fights on cabinet floors. There are accounts of citizens throwing shoes at politicians in cross-cultural settings. And most recently, a Virginia mayor made a Facebook post that read, "Joe Biden has just announced Aunt Jemima as his VP pick," as an attack on the Democratic candidate's plans for his VP selection. Two, our academic institutions, the paragon of civility, are becoming loutish places. I don't believe for one second that the ivory towers have been void of uncivility. It's just better equipped to wrap uncouthness intact. Three, the public square is turning into a prickly space. When has it not? This too is not new for us. What is new here is the evolution of the public square as we've known it. Powered by technology, the public square is now broader than anyone could have imagined. The 21st century man's exponential and uncontrolled reach shines an invasive bright light on core human behavior, intensifying the good and the bad alike through knee-jerk tweets, Instagram videos, and other viral content, creating a cacophony that forces people to believe that aggressiveness is the only path to break through, to be heard, and sometimes to even gain a sense of quiet. Though nothing changes much with people as it relates to wanting to feel respected and valued in all spheres, the world around us does, and it's often necessary to have space to reflect upon change for progress. This becomes increasingly difficult with the noise. Fortunately, because our essential communication needs remain the constant, the playbook for encouraging civility in the global community is already written. It's the foundation upon which humanity is designed upon. International organizations and brands alike can now leverage their platform to help society relearn its balance by investing in humanity, employing a balance in messaging, aligning humanness and business goals. This simple strategic act can encourage productivity, civility, and profitability. Thanks again for your time. So those are my words for today, Mr. Professor. I think you're on mute.
Now may I invite my esteemed colleague, Candice Roberts?
Hi. Is the sound okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Afla, for opening up the chat. I'm going to start my own timer here so that I won't, I'll be mindful of the 5 minutes. So I think that for those of you who know me, including my colleague, Dr. Montero, or know my work at all, you know that I do a lot of work on identity. And I talk a lot about identity, using identity as a theoretical concept. So I don't have enough time today in my 5 minutes to sort of relitigate the usefulness of that concept. But I will say that when I think about civility and communication in particular, I think about how there are essentially two components at play from the perspective of my research and sort of the philosophies of communication and social science. I think we see components of identity and community, and we can think of those in a lot of different ways, right? Depending on how anthropologists might think of the kind of subjectivity and collectivity of people, or psychologists, we might think of intrinsic and extrinsic communication. But ultimately, right, we're looking at these two parts, the individual and the group, or the identity and the community. And when I think about the breakdown of communication and ruptures in civility, what comes to my mind are the ways that those two pieces, the identity and the community piece, right, the individual and the collective, ways that they are out of balance. And I really enjoyed some of the things that Afua said before me, which really plays into that ideal as well, the ideal vision of the individual in society. And so when civility is challenged, or civility, we see the sort of fissures in civility. For me, it's because we don't see the identity, we don't see the individual addressed as a harmonious element in society. And so what I love about conversations like these and chats like these, when we think about civility, obviously it's not a problem that we're going to fix today. And I think all of the questions that we can all bring about are ways to conceive of problematizing, right, civility, kind of as Dr. Gershner said as well. And so one of the things that I'm bringing into my mind is some philosophy from Ivan Illich. And while I don't necessarily agree with all of Illich's positions on technology and society, I think there are a lot of useful applications that we can take from Illich and what he calls conviviality. So I made some notes about Illich's work on conviviality, which I think is one way, one sort of solution, or one tool that we can apply to communication and civility. Illich says people need not only to obtain things, above all, they need the freedom to make things among which they can live. So Illich is talking about what happens when individuals feel out of balance with their groups, with their communities. And he talks about the ways that our tools and our technologies further separate us from our communities. And this is not an anti-technology talk by any means, but I do think that we need to sort of reconsider the ways that our technologies are developed, as opposed to empowering people. And so when people don't feel empowered, when people don't feel their subjectivities in line with the collectivities that which they seek, when there are too few at the top of the pyramid, right, who are controlling all of the means and the ways that people gain autonomy and access to their own communities, then I think what we see is a rejection of civility. And I also think that what Elitch was really good at highlighting is the ways that we often mistake institutionalization for civility, so that when we see institutions kind of putting people into factions, it often seems as though that is civil, but it is not civil, as we all know, to take sort of the democratizing means and tools and access to technology away from the people and kind of concentrate them. And so moving forward, that would be my sort of contribution, I think, to understanding civility, is the ways that we can address that through conviviality and giving people the tools that they need in order to be able to practice their own autonomy in society. So thank you for letting me share today.
Professor Cecilia Krielesen. I know she's relaxing on the beautiful island of Sardinia.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, and this is well.
Okay, thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm so happy to participate to this global conversation. I hope you can understand my English, which is not so good, so I hope not to make so many mistakes. I teach corporate communication at the University of Perugia based in Italy. And my main interest in research is on corporate social responsibility. So I will try to speak very quickly about corporate social responsibility and civility. Civility needs citizens, and citizens have to be conscious of their rights, but also of their duties. And in the last decades, a new group of citizens has emerged, and this is corporation. In the 1980s, the term of corporate citizenship emerged in the literature and also among the society, and began to enter in the language of global business community. A landmark of this process has been the joint statement on global corporate citizenship and the leadership challenge for CEOs and boards that was signed during the World Economic Forum in New York in January 2002 by CEOs of 34 of the world's largest multinationals and corporations, including Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Philips, Deutsche Bank, and many others. But which are the responsibilities of corporations towards society? In 1979, Archie Carroll wrote a milestone article entitled "The Pyramids of Corporate Social Responsibility." The pyramids of corporate social responsibility is a simple framework that argues that the corporation have economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic responsibilities that responds to expectation that society has on these organizations. But corporations are not philanthropists. So why should corporations act in the interest of society? They expect to gain something. They expect to gain benefits in terms of competitive advantages. And that's perfectly consistent with what Archie Carroll says. At the bottom of the pyramid, there is economic responsibility. So corporation needs to have advantages from their corporate social responsibility in terms of reputation, product differentiation, customer loyalty, or risk reduction. This request stakeholder recognize legitimacy to corporate citizenship. And this takes us to the very heart of the issue, that is communication. Corporation needs to properly communicate their commitment towards society to obtain legitimacy for their corporate citizenship. This requests a force from the global business community, the force in the standard definition of communication to help companies to be perceived as reliable from their stakeholder, from customers, employee, public opinion, mass media, and stakeholders. So this is, in my opinion, the challenge of the next decade for academics, scholars, and also for everyone is interested in improving civilization, to support the process of developing standards in the field of corporate social responsibility communication. Because the more corporation will benefit from being good citizenship, the more the society will progress towards civility. Because we have a win-win perspective. Corporation win if they are more cooperative towards society, and at the same time, the society can progress towards more civility. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And now may I invite Cristina Perez Cordon. She's the linguist, specializes in linguistics, and she works at the United Nations, but she's not speaking here as on behalf of the United Nations, but as a linguistics specialist. Cristina?
Thank you, Basilio. And thank you so much for inviting me to join this conversation. Can you hear me and see me well?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I would like to focus my talk on communications, and more specifically on how civility is compromised by violence, when this violence is triggered by disagreement in communication, especially in social media. So the first thing that I would like to say is that, in my opinion, unfortunately, violence has become too common. So common that now we have like blind spots. We don't even see it sometimes. It has been easily validated and even justified. For example, when we see a clown emoji in a post or a verbal insult, I think that society is not bothered by it as it should be. This doesn't mean that technology is bad. I think that technology is good. It's a good tool. We are responsible for that. We use it in a good way or in a bad way. So technology is not to blame. The responsibility is on the user and how we use it. I would like to talk about 3 ideas. The first one is disagreement and conflict. The second one is how this message sometimes that civility is can weaken your message. And the third one is the idea that change doesn't come from being politically correct. So regarding the first one, disagreement and conflict, I think that disagreement doesn't equal to conflict only if poorly managed, if poorly handled. Actually, there is healthy disagreement, and I think that disagreement is crucial, is key, and is necessary to progress. I don't have much time, but let me give you a very quick example of that. Back in the 50s, the Dr. Alice Stewart, she was working to try to prove the correlation between pregnant women being X-rayed and their children being more likely to having cancer. And the whole approach was based on disagreement, on purpose. She was working with a statistician named George Neal, and he said that their professional relationship was based on, for this study, was based on disagreement. He said, my job is to prove Dr. Stewart wrong. is to look for this confirmation, to crunch the data, to crunch the number, to crunch the models and all the results to try to disprove her. Because by not being able to do so, he gave her the confidence to know that she was right. And that's how they decided to work together. And I think that's a very good example of how disagreement can be healthy and can be managed in a way that will help us to progress. Well, it took society or certain countries another 20-something years to stop X-raying pregnant women before they accepted her opinion. But here we are. Now we don't do it anymore. Regarding the second idea that I mentioned, that civility weakens your message, I strongly disagree with that. I heard that so many times. Not if your message is legit and your arguments are strong enough. You can be forceful, because force is not the same as violence. And of course, you can feel angry. You should feel angry sometimes, but you should be able to channel that feeling in a mature, productive way. And regarding the third idea that change doesn't come from being politically correct, yes, I agree. But the opposite of being politically correct is not being rude, is not being vulgar, is not being hurtful. You don't have to be cruel. You have to be maybe painfully clear, okay, and polite. And you have to be ready to listen to painfully clear ideas and to be able to open your mind and change your position, because it has to be both ways. So I would like to say that human beings, we don't need the same ideas, but we need the same respect. And you cannot, if I can use a metaphor because I'm a linguist, you cannot water a flower with blood and expect it to grow and glow. So violence is never an option. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. That's beautiful. And now may I invite Denise. Denise is a lawyer, and she practices a law in Mexico, just in the area of Sonora. So Denise, where are you?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. To begin, I would like to set out how I perceive civility for democracy. In my opinion, civility in public discourse is a tool to find common ground among diverse and opposite people's opinion, so we can enrich and obtain innovative and democratic solutions to public problems of general interest. Now, I will introduce some problems that we can find in the public discourse in Mexico. First, in the government speech, there are two different groups that sometimes are referred as the rich and the poor, seeing the first one as the oppressor and the latter as the victim. But this speech has a tendency to divide the society by social class. It does not empower people to change, nor make effort to deconstruct this symbolism of dominance. Also, it does not reintegrate the society as a whole. Instead, it hinders the cooperation between citizens. This fact can be reflected on social media when people from different backgrounds interact. If there is any pause from the government, there is always a discussion between those who are for or against the current government. It is common to see attacks ad hominem. Some people classify their opponents according to your political ideology, or gender, religion, social class, or level of education, just to demean or discredit them. But sometimes pressure groups might push people into this division through messages that produce fear, anxiety, and anger. Citizens are induced to take certain actions that serves to legitimate the interests of these groups. And in this context, civility is a form of resistance, in my opinion, because it provides an environment conducive to dialogue. Then our speeches might seek to set a critical conversation on society's well-being and not get stuck in personal attacks. Civility is crucial if we want to compel our politicians to solve problems of general interest by democratic means. But if we are manipulated by external messages in media or emotions, and will control ourselves, and certain pressure groups may take advantage of it. Hence, the public agenda will be set by them. And as an example, when we put attention on what the masses are showing in public spaces or in social media, some rights begin to disappear from the public attention, and other rights become particularly important. Therefore, the question is, who set this public agenda and who is deciding what must be a priority to the society? Was this set by democratic ways or just pushed by economic interest, by lobbies or pressure groups? Then, to reach civility in communication, individual and social efforts are needed. First, as responsible citizens, we need to critically analyze the information that we read or listen, not taking it personal and deconstruct the discourse. Also, we need to take into account that sometimes information is not based on true facts, but in simulated reality. This is why we must always ask ourselves, not just what is being said, but who say it and who financed it. What is the main purpose of the author? Why is he or she saying it? What are the possible consequences of the speech or their implications? Is there enough evidence to prove what is stated in the speech? And does the speaker or writer consider opposite views in their argument? As a society, we must demand civility in public speech and total disapproval of hate speech, because it induces to discrimination based on race, gender, social class, political ideology, or religion. And we also need to demand for public, inclusive, and critical debates on issues of public interest, where evidence and reasoned opinions might be presented by opposite groups of the society. Ad hominem attacks must be prohibited. It is important to understand that all rights finish where the rights of the other begins. And to finish, I would like to say that freedom of speech is the base of democracy, but only if we respect others' human rights. When we express ourselves, it can be achieved. Thank you. I think you are mute. Yes. Okay.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Denise. And now may I invite Professor Dimitris Charalambis of the University of Kapodistrian University of Athens in Greece.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Morning for you, evening for me. I have some very short comments or some very short thoughts or general thoughts about communication and civility. First of all, I think civility is simple. It means the respect of the other, of every other human being. And that is the main, shall we say, content of a social contract, a democratic social contract. And there is where we have the big problems. I will say in a process of the last 40 years. That means in the last 40 years, we lost the sense of values that we understood to have after the Second World War, and we come more and more in an unequal society. Okay, that is not very new what I tell you. There is a big discussion about that, but I think that is the main point. And I think that recognition of the other is the main element of democratization. And all the discussion in the late time about recent time about Black Lives Matters and like that, we see that from the Declaration of Independence, from all the moment where white owners of slaves opens the way for democracy in a crazy way for us, the recognition of the other was the fight against slavery, against discrimination of women, against all forms of discrimination. That means to recognize the other. And that is the problem now, since, as I said, 40 years, that through this inequality, which become more and more crucial in our societies, in every society, the pandemic shows us in a very, very tragic way what means inequality. And that this inequality shows us that civility is not anymore possible, or it has very big difficulties to become possible, because people feel exclude. More and more people feel exclude, and more this exclusion leads people to a kind of irrational behavior. I will say, okay, there are parts of our society that have been always irrational, if you like, but it is this main way, this main procedure in the last years that's more and more this opening of the social stratification. More and more people has no possibility to in this shall we say social movement to come from down to up. That is a situation where people looks for another way. Somebody talked before, a lady talked before about identity. It was if you are excluded, if your social identity is not more accepted, or only on the paper but not in reality, then you look for other forms of identity. We had this experience in the 30s. We had, in a way, the same Great Depression, the same crisis, the same, and more, thank God, not yet the same political crisis. But the more you have this situation, the more people looks for irrational solution. I will say Donald Trump, the Brexit case, and all the Eastern European appearances of nationalism, or the appearance of racism again. That is all a result of this situation of not being, for many people, more and more people not being accepted, be social exclude, and looking for, shall we say, old, anti-modern, para-modern, as you like, solutions for their identity. And in the same time, we have a public discussion, that means the public communication, the communication in the public sphere, in a situation like this become more and more characterized from demagogy. Demagogues are, shall we say, more and more modern politicians. You see Trump, you see Bolsonaro, Orban, all those guys, they are more or less sociopaths and demagogues. And this, shall we say, there are two directions. From above comes demagogy, and from downstairs come the feeling of not being accepted. And that is, shall we say, a very difficult, a very dangerous situation, in which our main problem became the social contract. We had, and more than we had before, after the war, a very deep or a deepening process of the social contract. And now we are in a moment of more and more of a declining of the social contract. And in the same time, irrationality means also, and we see it now with the pandemic and mainly with the environment, we have more and more a powerful discourse that that science doesn't matter. That means we have in all, as I would say, in all fields of our life, this irrationality that is coming more and more strong. And I say we have a discussion lately. I am a professor of political science, and we had a big discussion in the hope what happens after Trump. That means if Trump loses in November, and he doesn't do a kind of a very, very strange American coup d'etat, as it looks sometimes, what happens? It is not so easy. We have a very, very long way to go. We have to reconstruct our social contract. We have to understand that we have to change our attitude on the environment. We have to change our socio-economic paradigm. That means we are now in a very, in my opinion, in a very negative moment. We have the possibility, we see people react, we have the possibility to have an answer, but we have a very long way in front of us to overcome the results, as I said, in my opinion, of the last 40 years. Thank you very much.
To chew on. And now may I invite my colleague Elizabeth Fondren, Professor of Journalism at St. John's University.
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes. So as
Can you make yourself seen?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you see me?
Yes,
Okay,
we see you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. As Basilio said, I'm a professor, assistant professor of journalism at St. John's. Thank you so much, Basilio and Mina, for hosting this really timely and global conversation. I would like to share a few and brief thoughts on what has happened to the norm of objectivity this summer, and I also have some questions that I think would be great to kind of circulate in this global context. So, as I said, I think that what has happened due to COVID and also the lack of consistent government communication, and then really starting in June, the Black Lives Matter protests, all of these really ruptures have impacted journalism, how journalists work, but also how the public perhaps perceives the importance of media coverage. So this is something that, as you can imagine, I will talk about with my students in their reporting classes starting August 24th. And let me just start by saying in Europe, and particularly Germany, where I'm from, news media and newspapers in particular have a very long tradition of taking on partisan views. This means that readers or viewers of news have often looked for a particular perspective when they consume a particular brand or journalism product. As we know, this is very different in the kind of Anglo-American context. And then, as I said, really since June this year, some American media outlets, including NPR, have taken very clear positions. And I think this is very interesting. So, for example, NPR has positioned itself in support of the Black Lives Matter protests and the demand for right to live and to hold police accountable for using deadly force against Black people. So my question is it partisan for the press to say that Black Lives Matter? Other newsrooms, you might have heard the controversial story that the New York Times published. This was an op-ed by the conservative senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. He wrote an op-ed piece that was called "Send in the Troops," which many critics said threatened Black lives. In this op-ed that was published in early June, Cotton called for a wide-scale military crackdown on riots in cities. The op-ed caused immediate uproar, both inside the New York Times. There were staff walkouts, but also outside, as critics, but also public opinion criticized this really extreme piece of journalism. The Times opinion page editor, James Bennett, attempted to explain his decision to run the piece. This didn't go really well. A few days later, the Times editorial board issued an official apology to all readers for running it. And then a few days later after that, Bennett, the opinion page editor, resigned. So my first question is really, what are the boundaries between free speech, professional decision-making, journalistic objectivity, but perhaps more importantly, moral decency? What are the boundaries and who gets to draw them? Who decides what is in bounds and out of bounds in times like these? Is it the press's job to draw those lines and defend those boundaries? That same week, I did a little bit of research. That same week in early June, when the New York Times ran this cotton op-ed piece, the conservative-leaning Pittsburgh Post-Gazette decided to bar some of its Black reporters from covering the protests, citing fears that they would be too biased. And at the same time, the left-leaning news site Axios recently announced that it would bail out its reporters from jails if they had covered protests and would be arrested. So I think that really the first half of 2020 has seen several paradigm shifts. I think that, scholars, but also the public is not yet sure what this really could mean for journalism. Some newsrooms, including, as I said, New York Times, are struggling with this question. We perhaps see a changing stance on the importance of objectivity. And I think this is a development that communication scholars around the world should pay close attention to. So the question that I want to leave you with, and we can discuss this, is in 2020, is it still possible to be fair and transparent and still be objective? So thank you so much.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Brilliant. And now may I invite Helene Diabanza Peterson. She speaks to us from Uganda, and she brings a very multicultural experience in her life from Uganda, Congo, with a foot in Sweden as well. So Helene? 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 Do you hear me?
Yeah, I'm trying to get the mic. Oh my God.
Okay, we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I just saw the video. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to join this very interesting conversation. So for me, it's a bit maybe of a different angle because I have moved to Uganda and I have had the chance to sort of see how communication and civility works here. And I just to give it a bit of a context, Uganda is a small but very diverse country in Eastern Africa. And it has 56 ethnic groups, and which of course creates a lot of challenges. So especially in communication, because people are so different in different parts of the country. So for example, due to this cultural diversity, they may have different traditions, different way of thinking, different mindset. So that, of course, that makes the communication that it can easily be misinterpreted.
Okay, we lost your sound. We don't hear you. Helene, we cannot hear you. We don't hear you. How do I send a message?
I did send a message to Helen that we lost the sound, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. No.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you now.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So
yeah.
Was I lost for a long time?
Yes, for the last minute or so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Soon after you told us that Uganda is a very diverse place.
Yes. So
okay.
yeah. Oh, that was a long time ago. Okay. No. So I wanted to say that because of these different tribes, of course, that creates communication conflicts and sometimes problems. And on a daily basis, you have these small little issues, among people. And I took an example. For example, the tribe Bachiga. They are known for being more straightforward and direct. And then the largest tribe, Baganda, which is the one who is here in Kampala, they can be more soft and indirect. And when those two meet, it can be like the Bachiga find the Baganda very insincere, and while the Baganda find the Bachiga totally rude. So these are the problems in the communication that can occur. And also, just to take another cultural example, but that still creates issues, can be that, for example, the Baganda people, they kneel down, like the women are quite submissive, I would say, like in how the culture is or the tradition, that they should kneel down for their husband. While in other tribes in Uganda, this has never been heard of. They have no idea that you should do that. So of course, this is communication problems that can be created. But then now, due to the economy and the relocation of people, of course, Ugandans are actually, as a people, very gentle, very respectful. So the civility, I would say, is not really, it's not that big of a problem here. But it's more that it's differences between these tribes. But because of the economy and how the world is, they really try to seek unity. So they try to find a way of bridging these gaps. So, for example, English, which is the official language, it used to be a British colony, has become the lingua franca that everyone speaks. But then also, which I think is very important to add, in Uganda, the youth is very big. It's actually the country that has most youth in the world. So around 80% is under 30, and the biggest group among them is 16 years old. So of course that creates a way of communication that is, how young people are. They like to use slang and they like to be cool. And this has sort of also, what can I say? This has also encouraged a language that is called Yuglish, like an urban language, but not like a rude urban language. It's very used by the young, of course, but there are also expressions that adults use. So it's interesting, and that is a language that combines English with the local language. They use the local language expressions, but in English. But there can also be like slang words. So I just found that interesting with the communication in Uganda that I wanted to share. But then I also have another country, which is Congo. And Congo is where I grew up. So I would just touch on that very quick. And a bit compare, actually, because I found the interesting thing with Congo is that Congo is large. It's like huge comparing to Uganda, and with a double population or something. But in Congo also has very different tribes and different languages, and the official language is French. But what is a bit different is that in Congo, and that is pretty unique for African countries, has actually a language, also an urban language that is called Lingala. And now Lingala, that can be, it is, for me, I think that is kind of unique and maybe a good thing that there is a language that most people speak in the country, but it is not unproblematic because Lingala has a characteristic of being very raw. Some people find it extremely rude, and it creates a lot of communication issues between young and the older generation. So it's actually not a generational problem, but it's a communicational problem due to a very rude, or what can I say, abrasive language. So I just found that interesting that in Uganda, you have so many different tribes and different languages, and they try to be united or unified by English or by Yuglish in a good, positive way. While in Congo, which is a fantastic country, I love it, but in Congo, it is a problem with Lingala. And then I'm not talking about the original Lingala, which is one of the local language for some tribe. This is a language that has popped up with many influences from other languages, and especially French. And it's just the way it is talked, and it's just the way it is. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can say that, but it's maybe not. Yeah, it creates an approach that is not so civilized always.
Thank you very much, Helene. Thank you for sharing that. And now may I invite Juliet Allen. Juliet Allen comes to us from Germany, and her world is a corporate world, and she's looking from that perspective. Julia?
Thank you, Professor Montero. Hi, everyone, and thank you for putting together such a diverse panel. I love hearing all these different perspectives. Really appreciate it, and appreciate that I'm able to contribute today. So yeah, as Basilio said, I am originally from Germany, but studied also my master's degree at St. John's in international communications, and then moved back to Germany to join one of the major sporting goods companies in the world. But today I'm not speaking on behalf of the company, rather on behalf of myself and sharing my personal perspective, drawing from my professional experiences. So when I think about communication and civility, preparing for the session, I thought about, okay, what's my personal experience and impression with this topic? And at first glance, I actually don't necessarily see civility on the decline in spaces like the workplace, in universities, or in my conversations with families or close friends. However, from my previous work experience, I do get the impression that establishing empathic communication, both within teams and from leaders towards their teams, is a recurring challenge. And maybe you can also relate to the feeling that making each other feel acknowledged and understood and respected when communicating is also a key challenge in romantic or friend relationships. So moving on more obviously, I do see civility is really on decline in spaces that we've already covered now in previous presentations. So in media reporting, social media, and when it comes to the tone of voice in political discourse. I think that's quite obvious. And just to share a few examples also, so in Germany, for example, in the recent past weeks, politicians have reported to increasingly receive death threats. And then again, when I lived in the US during the past presidential campaign, I also observed that political debates tended to be quite personally offending and polarized and even rude at times. Then when it comes to news reporting, I really also observed recently that more and more offensive and aggressive and attacking also. And then when we looked at social media, obviously comments that people leave are sometimes very hateful and offensive, talking about hate speech. So all this reflection brought me or reminded me of a book that I have read while I was in the US. And I'm going to read out a quote from it that says, "We're finding a study that in the past 20 years, there's been a 40% decline in all the ways we know how to measure empathy among college students." Now, this is what Sherry Turkle said in her last book, Reclaiming Conversation, in 2015 already. So she said that the sharpest decline has happened in the last 10 years and researchers associated with the rise of mobile devices that distract us from traditional communication. Now, I wonder what the study would say today, even 5 years later. And I think Candice has already touched on this as well. Digital communication really creates a barrier between people, and it depersonalizes the way we communicate, because we don't have to look each other in the eye anymore. And this is what Sherry Turkle argues. We lose our capability for empathy because we don't actually see the facial expression of the person we offend when we say something wrong or when we are hateful. So also, I'm not a technology hater, but just wanted to bring back this track of thought that digital technology and the way we communicate there does add to the problem if we don't use it right, and if we don't educate the upgrowing generations on it. So then another thing that I wanted to touch upon is that in PR research, a well-known model defining what we really need in order to have real dialogue says that one of the 5 key components that we need for dialogue is empathy. So again, the same thing. So I was wondering, okay, if we lose our ability for empathy with this increasing digital communication, does this mean that we fail to have constructive and mutual dialogue? And if we say, okay, dialogue increasingly fails, does that mean that we fail to verbally solve conflict, hence move on to rudeness or even violence? And this has been discussed in the chat extensively already. So besides our decreasing capability for empathy, I see one other main reason for the decline of civility in the public sphere that I wanted to touch on, which is that in today's attention economy, media and brands are really increasingly emotionalizing, personalizing, and even sometimes scandalizing what they publish, just in order to cut through the information overflow and attract people's attention. And I think that's also a problematic development. Now, I was wondering, finally, as my final point and food for thought for everyone, what can we do as communicators to reestablish civility in social media, political and public discourse, and even interpersonal communication? And I think that with strategic communication, so setting the right tone of a conversation, we can actually do a lot, because words matter, and the way we phrase things really changes the setting of the conversation. So if we choose the right words and tone in news reporting, TV shows, organizational communication, and even personal chats, I think we have the opportunity and even responsibility to role model civility and respectful communication. And I think everyone can drive this, even if they don't work in communications. But especially when you're producing public communication content, I think we should hold ourselves accountable to really universal ethical moral standards of being respectful, fair, and non-judgmental. And this, so I found while I was researching one phrase, which is digital citizenship. So in the end, I think it's also about establishing digital citizenship, teaching children early on how to use digital media, how to communicate on social platforms, and how to apply the same rules to them that they would apply in interpersonal communication.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you. Really, thank you so much. And now, may I invite Professor Laura Tommaso from the University of Molise in Italy?
Hi, hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Maybe see you.
Yes, thank you for this invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity of being in touch with people who are just putting on the table so many interesting issues. And today, I would like to talk about civility, or better saying, incivility, in connection with the concept of ageism, and from the perspectives of linguistics and human communication, while briefly reviewing some recent manifestations of this form of discrimination in public discourse. To start, I would like to give just a working definition of ageism. The term, maybe you know this, but the term was coined by Robert Butler in 1968 and refers to any form of discrimination against people on the grounds of age. Specifically discriminations against older adults. So 50 years after he introduced the word, and 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, we still consider ageism to be deeply embedded in society. A society which tends to be youth-centric, emphasizing attributes like individualism and independence. Within this context, old age has been seen as a time of decay and vulnerability, a dreary stretch of life leading to physical demise or social death. So, briefly put, growing old is no reason for celebration, at least in Western society. So, in contrast to racism or sexism, ageism is the only ism to which all of us are exposed. Therefore, we are all going to benefit from eradicating ageism and living in a society for all ages in which age is no longer a threat, an obstacle, or a burden. So I would like to say that ageism is manifested in the way we talk, we think, feel, and act towards age and aging. And these ageist attitudes and perceptions are perpetuated in many ways, for example, by the lack of positive images of older adults in popular culture, in advertising, as well as the widespread use of demeaning language about old age and divisive rhetoric employed to talk about, for instance, generational conflict or young versus old. So studies shows that ageism is particularly prevalent in the healthcare system, in medical training, and the labor force. As a linguist and public culture scholar, I'm mainly interested in the way ageism is communicated or talked about. My theoretical and methodological approach is based on the idea that societies are continually changing, social changes are reflected in language, and that language in its turn is an instrument of social transformation. I also rely on the assumption that language use symbolically represents fundamental dimensions of social behavior and human interaction. So far from being merely a passive mirror reflecting the world around us, language plays an active role in constructing reality. Let's take a couple of examples. For instance, these examples have recently circulated in public discourse and have somehow positioned older adults in a disadvantaged role. So although older adults are occasionally constructed in a positive light because they are actively involved in the community, please don't forget the ongoing narrative of successful aging, active aging, or perceived as socially and aesthetically adequate. They are often lumped together, grouping everyone over the age of 65 and confronted with stereotyping and prejudice in public and private spheres. Commonly, talking about older people as elderly or seniors evokes images of frailty and incompetence. Policies, legislations, and news articles that present population aging like a tsunami, a bomb, or an emergency or a crisis, an attempt to tackle, and here I quote, the problem of aging, further enhance and perpetuate ageism. Moreover, the discursive construction of old people as economic leaners who cost too much, as bed blockers clogging up hospital emergency departments, repeatedly brought up in public discourse, can lead to latent feeling of anxiety, running much deeper than just negative perceptions of aging among individuals. And one last example that I would like to focus on is the way older adults have been misrepresented and undervalued in the public discourse surrounding the pandemic. So we may remember that when the virus emerged, the narrative was focused on older people as the vulnerable group. Younger people, it was said, were not so much at risk. This public health message, quickly adopted, was sometimes turned into an ageism joke, hence the hashtag, which was quite viral, boomer remover, which appeared around the end of February. But other comments coming from political leaders can be considered more vicious. In an interview, the former health minister, Ukraine's former health minister, said people over 65 were already corpses, and the government response should focus on those, and I quote, still alive. In Texas, to come to an U.S. perspective, Dan Patrick, who is the state's lieutenant governor, suggested those over 70, and I quote, sacrifice themselves for the good of the economy. So these remarks do more than just legitimize ageism. They also impact care and support for older adults. So public health messages have a way of becoming public health realities. So when the pandemic was at its peak, some hospitals in Italy used 65 as a cutoff when providing ventilators for those with severe symptoms. Conversely, and ironically, ageist comments put younger people at greater risk. So they suggest youth possess an invulnerability, which is hardly the case. So my hope is that with this commentary, I can contribute to shed some light on the persistent and structural incivility against older adults circulating in public discourse in recent times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you. Thank you. And now I invite Luisa Ortiz. Luisa Ortiz comes to us from a deep experience in the world of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Luisa? Luisa?
Hello, everybody. How are you?
Good, good. Can we see you?
I think I can see you. Can you see me?
Yeah, okay, very good.
This is fantastic. I am very excited. I had prepared something, but I believe that after listening to everyone, there are adjustments to be made. And so I want to elevate what my colleagues are saying, and I want to bring another problem or another context to this conversation. And I want to focus today on the notion of the shadow pandemic, which is what the UN Women organization has defined as violence against women. In this context of the pandemic and in this context of this huge, amazing communications as well as public policy shift in our countries, the effect and the impact of language, discourse, as well as policy related to women is something that we need to be very conscious about. I personally run a helpline that is connected, that connects individuals who are defending human rights, land rights, women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, or who are actually advocating or covering these topics. And what we have found on the helpline is something that I want to talk about to bring a little bit of a practical context in the same way that most of my colleagues have. We work specifically, and this is an interesting note to say in the context of civility as well as communication, we are working with people who identify as women, and that is a very important aspect to note. Gender in the discourse of civility in the world is a very contested space. So I want to set that up, and so when I refer to women, I refer to people who identify as women, as well as gender non-binary or gender non-conforming individuals. So that's it. Let me just tell you a few aspects of the work that we do on the helpline, and you will see the underlying thread that I want to bring out to the conversation. From early 2019 to early 2020, the helpline would receive 2 to 3 weekly calls or weekly messages. Most of the time we work on text messages, which is also very, very interesting. And most of those calls and most of those communications focus on 3 things that my colleagues have touched upon. On the one hand, most of the violence that happens to these women happens online, which means that it happens in parallel, or it happens in addition, or it happens in connection to digital discourses. What does that mean? It is connected to the trends, it is connected to the misogyny, the misogynoir, the violence against immigrants, the violence against all of those people who are considered to be either not part of the mainstream or endangering or challenging those discourses that seem or are considered to be mainstream. Of the 52%, of the 100% callers that we got before the pandemic, 52% were journalists. And of those 52% journalists, the main concerns discursively, in terms of language and in terms of very specific affectations on their lives, were harassment, workplace harassment, and that would mean lewd comments on Twitter or on direct messages coming from their editors, from their newsroom colleagues, as well as from the readers of their stories. We have meters of how lewd the comments can be and how intense the comments can be. If you want more information, you should check Michelle Ferrier's fantastic work on Trollbusters in the University of Florida. My colleague Michelle Ferrier is, a specialist on this particular notion of lewdness. The other aspects that people communicate to us, and here's where I enter into Dr. Roberts as well as Emily Ortiz's comments, it has more to do with the relationship between the community and what the person and how the person is affecting the community. Intimate partner violence, domestic violence, as well as what and how a woman should behave online is very, very interesting here, because the violence is going to come from the specific position of a person should be silenced. Maybe that is a word that I haven't heard in our conversation. How do we approach the silence or those who should be silenced? And thirdly, discourse as not necessarily only words or language, but also images. And the incivility of the use of pornography as a form of violence against women, female communicators, as well as people who are expressing their opinions, is on the rise. Most of the people who come to the helpline are coming to denounce pornographic violence against them, which can be, it has many, many names. It's been called cyber pornography. It's been used unlawful dissemination of intimate content through the web, but it also has to do with sextortion, the extortion, the use of images, personal images, or montage, which happened to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a couple of years ago. It is one of the most extreme forms of incivility, extreme forms of violence, and I don't even want to talk about the patriarchy. So what do we do with all this? 3 questions that the women that we talk to, and now I come back to the pandemic. Since March to today, we moved from 2 or 3 calls per week to 2 or 3 calls per day. And what we see in this past 4 or 5 months is very striking. On the one hand, the question is, why is this happening to me? Second, have I crossed a line? Third, what can we do to counter? What can we do to stop this? I only have 3 things to say, and I will yield the floor. On the one hand, the lack of commitment. And I was really, really stricken by a colleague who was talking about corporations, the lack of commitment from the tech giants into accepting that the moderation of speech in terms of violence, hate speech, as well as all sorts of racist, sexist, and political violence is a reality, and we need to talk about it. We need to put our money where our mouth is. Second, it's a very difficult word to say. In Spanish, it's very easy. In English, it's very difficult. It's the tabloidization of violence against women. Everybody wants to dwell in the gory details of what happens to a woman, if she was raped, if she was abused. And when we follow the Harvey Weinstein coverage of his misdemeanors or his acts of crime, of criminality, what you see is this tendency to lure people into the nitty-gritty details of how the violence was performed. So that will lead to victimization. So I want to bring silence, corporations, victimization and re-victimization of the people who are suffering this violence through the discourses that we cannot simply stop. So what would be my suggestion today? Well, we have the helpline, and what we do is we empower people to change the relationship they have to violence. So I would ask people on the chat and our colleagues to think about this specific question. How are you, and how would you change the relationship you have to violence and discourses against women? Thank you so much, Vasily.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Lu. And really appreciate it. And now may I invite Miriam Diaz-Bosch from Blanquerna University in Barcelona.
Yes. Do you hear?
Miriam? Okay, there you are.
Okay. Thank you very much. So prior, I would just like to say that I come from Spain. I am talking on our holiday break, and I am the director of a center on media, religion, and culture. This is what I am going to talk about. I'd like to focus the attention now in the role of leadership and dialogue linked to civility. I believe that one aspect lacking today in our society is trust in others, and trust as belief in the truth or ability of someone or something. We cannot have a dialogue with someone we do not trust. We are here because Basile engaged us in this conversation. We could not follow or collaborate in projects with people we do not rely on. And references leaders are needed to foster our conversation and to enrich the world. Those leaders need to understand the rules of dialogue. In our context, now in Spain, in the midst of the COVID-19 situation, trust has dropped, and only some practitioners in the field of medicine and some nurses are considered trustworthy. Not politicians, not thinkers or philosophers, not even pop stars. My field, as I said, is religion and media. I am convinced that intercultural dialogue and a slow and good journalism could be linked and could help to create a better society. More knowledge means more capacity to understand and to appreciate otherness. We live in this hyper-connected society, and taking into account the influence media have on society, the impositions of the quest for speed come at the expense of quality and rigor, and could lead to misunderstandings with unfortunate social consequences at many levels. In this sense, I think journalism trustworthiness has been increasingly regarded with growing skepticism. And important questions arise here. What do we believe in? Is trust still a value? We know that one of the rules of intercultural and interreligious dialogue is that it takes time, given that it requires patience and continuity to build trust, conditions familiar also to good journalism. We can explain things slowly and with detail. We could expect more from our media system, and we could give more as users as well. Let's talk for a minute about leadership that serves, because civility needs good leaders able to foster this fruitful dialogue. I think as society, we need to develop a system, a value system that serves. On this matter, for instance, servant leaders assert the importance of values, belief, and principles in leadership. Healing, also empathy and listening are crucial. Trust, but also appreciation of others and empowerment. And those values are core elements and are not only topics, but methods. As dialogue, it is a method, not only a topic. Civility needs the values of humility and respect for others. Also, the personal values of leaders, such honesty and integrity, play a primary role here. Trust holds together society. I'd like to finish evoking the significant role of our personal actions, as it has been mentioned and I have appreciated a lot in today's discussion. It's useless to blame society, politicians, or old organizations not being able to connect and to make the world a better place without acknowledging our responsibility. The philosopher Edith Stein could help us to understand how to nourish and protect true humanity and bring it to development. This is our task, and we cannot delegate it to others. We could delegate perhaps tasks, but cannot delegate responsibility. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miriam. And now may I invite Stefan Malovic from Zagreb, Croatia. Stefan?
Basilio, it seemed to me that Stefan was unable to connect with audio.
I see, okay. Okay, so now I may invite Professor Thomas Bauer from University of Vienna, Austria. Mr. Bauer? I see you there. Professor Bauer. See you there. You maybe have difficulty connecting. Okay. Is he coming?
Are you hear me?
Yes, hear you. Okay, wonderful.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I was had difficulties to come in, so I couldn't follow what you have already been discussed. But what I would like to bring into this discussion is a critics to our theoretical thinking. My approach is that we need maybe another logical framing of a communication and media theories than we do. I understand theory as an interruption of the routines of thinking. Doing theories means understanding the complexity beyond the practice. If you do not go to this complexity beyond the praxis, we do not really find a theory. We just repeat the idea of practice. And my idea is that, or what I'm observing is that our theories are very much affirmative to the practice of communication, in the sense, as far as it does not make any problems, it's fine. Or let's conceptualize communication as a way or as a tool or as a habit to do in order to avoid any conflict or any complexity or any problem. Doing a theory means we need a logical level, and we are, until now, my feeling is we are doing our theoretical concepts on the logics of economy, of mechanics, of technology, of mathematics, and we do not really dare to go further to more open concepts. Concepts of communication, they are on the logics of anthropology, of sociology, really understanding social or sociality as a concept of communication, as understanding communication as a concept of a society or doing the society. So I think we are weak in our theoretical concepts. We do not really dare to produce complexity, and that's why we, when we hit upon the complexity of a practice of communication, we say yes, we have to do as well. So all the values of communication, we treat them somehow as add-ons, as decoration, as qualitative decoration of communication, and we forget that, for example, civility, what we are talking about, is not just an ethical decoration or something which we should give to each other. It's an intrinsic moment of communication. It's an intrinsic moment of the society. As well, all the other values like attention, like understanding. It's a question of an intrinsic interest, and the word of interest says what I want to say. Interesse, to be with or within the other. So when we try to talk about civility or any other values of communication, I think we need really really need to talk about that communication is just a construct where there is also embedded the idea of communication, and the idea of communication we can find as well in the idea of a society or in the idea of a culture. So those three constructs need each other, and we cannot separate them from each another. So what I would want to say or to bring in very late now is just to be more theoretical in an emancipative way, emancipation of those values we are now in search of, like practicability of communication, like political correction, political correctness, like success of communication, result of communication. All those models are built on the logic of economy. Invest just as much in order to have the most effect. So far, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thomas Bauer. Thank you, that was brilliant. And now may I invite Professor Tracy Gottlieb of the Seton Hall University, New Jersey.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Professor Gottlieb.
Yes, I'm a journalism history professor at Seton Hall University. And so I approach this topic from an historical perspective. We think of ourselves as civilized people in civilized times. And that's why incivility is upsetting to us. I'm going to embrace the simple definition that our colleague from Athens used, and that was that civility is respect for every other human being. But from my perspective, we see incivility everywhere today, from the front entrance at Walmart, where an unmasked conspiracy theorist is raging against a cheerful store greeter, or from the pages of the New York Times, where columnists pick on the way the president looks, his hair and his tan. Many of us point the finger at Donald Trump and say he started it. And without a doubt, Mr. Trump is the grand poobah of incivility. Whoops, I'm sorry, there I go. In 2015, Trump insulted our war hero, John McCain, with the throwaway, "I like people who aren't captured." Then, after McCain died, Trump refused to let it go. He continued to insult McCain, even though a prime rule of etiquette and civility is that we never speak ill of the dead. Beyond that, the ceaseless attacks on the mainstream media, which has been spearheaded by Mr. Trump, is uncivil and is raising public mistrust of the media in a very dangerous way. We can blame Trump, but the reality is that the concept of civility in society and in journalism has been on a slippery slope long before. Alexander Hamilton, founder of the New York Post and most famous Broadway star, died in a duel with Aaron Burr after Hamilton insulted Burr in print and also made disparaging remarks about him at a dinner party. In the 19th century, when abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave an impassioned speech denouncing slavery, supporters on the floor of denouncing slavery supporters on the floor of Congress, he was beaten unconscious by a colleague. And then the Southern newspapers weighed in and were unanimous in their support of incivility. One paper called it a glorious deed. Another said, we concur that if thrashing is the only remedy, then we might need to do it regularly. We always think of our time as the worst time for incivility, but I'd hazard to say that we are no worse. It just seems that we're worse because we're living through it ourselves, and because we're commenting on it, and because there are so many more opportunities for incivility today. Sometimes it's newspapers' jobs to report on incivility, because when the President of the United States insults you, well, that's news. Last year, the New York Times ran a story, the 598 people, places, and things Donald Trump has insulted on Twitter, a complete list. That was in May of 2019. Imagine how many people would be on that list now. One solution for journalism, and I say this only slightly facetiously, would be to stop treating the angry rants of the president as news. Just shut it down. Trump's point of view on Twitter is to always provoke and to always shift the conversation. Just, I think it was last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, on the day when the gross domestic product tanked to its lowest point ever, on the same day that another million people filed for unemployment in the United States, and at nearly the same time of day that former President Obama was delivering an eloquent eulogy to a fallen civil rights hero, Trump tweeted out yet another rant about the rigged election and suggested a delay in the November event. What if no one had taken the bait? What if no one had paid any attention to it? In other circumstances, newspapers find themselves in a position of moderating incivility on their own pages. When our colleague Lou Ortiz was speaking just a few minutes ago about lewdness in newsrooms, it was like a light bulb went off in my head, because I never even approached it from that perspective. But as a former woman journalist, I certainly can attest to what she has to say. Some publications have dealt with this by shutting down comment sections in newspapers. NPR is one, for example. Comment section had been taken over by trolls. That solution stifles conversation. But do you really want to be having a conversation with a troll who is trying to provoke you to be uncivil? My perspective is I'm embracing what Michelle Obama said 5 years ago now. If they go low, you go high. Newspapers are trying to go high, but they're fighting a battle that all the speakers who have gone before me today have pointed out. And so I'm not providing answers. I'm just asking more questions. Newspapers need, it's a matter of national security, I would think, to defend the importance of fairness and the importance of the pursuit of truth. But when you have a commander-in-chief who has to be fact-checked on a daily basis, therein lies the problem. I look forward to more conversations with you. Thank you very much.
Professor Van Vu from the Academy of Journalism and Communication in Hanoi, Vietnam.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so good evening from Hanoi. It's so good to see all of you here. It's already very late in Hanoi, and after this, I'm going to bed. So I'm working at the Academy of Journalism and Communication, and for the last few years, I'm working in a media literacy project the project aimed to study the essential knowledge and skill in order to help the students to be able to use the media for their personal growth and social development. We have been doing that in 5 years with university in Thailand, in Malaysia, Austria. Professor Thomas Bauer, who spoke earlier, was also the member of the project. And because of that background, I would like to talk about civility in the lines of the capacity or the competence of using media for the personal growth and social development. The first thing that I should say is that the people should have the skill and knowledge to use the media. And the problem is, this is not taught in the school, even with media students. This should be part of their lifelong learning instead of something from official education. Because we cannot assume that media can be used that's by anyone, like you can cook, because it is necessary that we have to learn to use it, to master it, in order to serve the purpose in our life. This is because the media has both the emancipation and the control. And to quote an author, he is saying that the media is both the enemy and the friend. So if we know how to use the media in a good way, it is our friend. And if we don't know how to use it, then it will be our enemy. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I think that people should have the responsibilities to use media. Responsibility means both the legal limitation and the ethical obligation. Because if we only use the media for our own purpose, and we don't care about others, then it may harm other benefits. It may harm the benefit of the societies. It is that's life. You have to drink and enjoy responsibly. And if you drink, you shouldn't drive. There's the same thing with the media. You should know how to use it in a way that is responsible to yourself and to others. And we should be able to ask the question, for example, like, is this good for me? And also, is that good for the society? If, for example, I'm going to post or going to write something in Facebook, for example. But we have this problem in our country too, especially with young people. We have the saying, young people often say, the hand is faster than the brain. That is, the young people, they cannot make the consideration when they are using the social media or they are using it without the social responsibility. That would be the second dimension of civility that I would like to talk about. And the third is that we should use the media as a values. And by a values, I want to say that we should be able to use the media for our personal growth and at the same time, the social development. If we can really do that, it becomes not only our skills, our ability to use the social or the media for ourselves, but it also becomes our values. And I think that the responsible use of the media will make us valuable to the society, make us responsible members of the society. So that is why I think that the media should not be only regarded as a function, as a means of communication, but should be more as a social values. That is, we should be able to use this for our personal development and at the same time to use it to promote social development. And with that three dimension in mind, I would like to conclude the civility in three words. That is, being reasonable in the use of the media. Second, to be responsible in the use of the media. And the third, to be mindful of using media for their own growth and social development. With that, I would like to conclude my talk, and thank you very much for the attention.
Professor Jadan, I know you're
Hi,
there.
here I am.
Okay,
Can you,
very good.
can you
Okay.
see me and hear me?
Yes, wonderful. Professor Jadani is at Dubai University.
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Dubai. And thank you for allowing me to share with you my reflections from the Arab world on today's webinar's global conversation on communication and civility. So I'll start with trust. Trust, I would say, was, is, and will always be a vital element for cultures to survive in an authentic and ethical way into existence. This means that civil societies, as independent organizations, cannot serve the peoples without civil societies in terms of cultures reaching civility in all its aspects. A second point is trust collapsed in the modern Arab societies as well as in the Western ones, on the cultural and on the intercultural level. The evidence for that is the phenomenon of societies moving in the same spiral of uncivility, as Professor Bazili said, since longest time, unable to come out of the spiral of weaponized and cultural imperialisms and occupations, the spiral of racism, the spiral of extremism, hostility, and violence. The modern Arab societies did not reach civility in terms of cultural urbanization since the days of imperialism and colonialism. They are dependent on their colonials in the West in most aspects of political, economical, and social communication. The collapse of trust in the West means pessimism and chaos in the Arab world, because the Arab world considers the West intraculturally as a role model, serving its own societies, but far from its behavior on the intercultural level of communication. When talking about the absence of civility around the globe leads to violence, to the violence we experience in all coexistential aspects today. Civility is the key and base for solving cultural and intercultural issues around the world. Bypassing civility creates a spiral of uncivility, yes. And breaking the spiral can be achieved by raising generations with awareness of wisdom and awake consciousnesses or enlightenment. Bypassing civility leads to the following attributes of our current reality: racism all over the world, prejudices and hostility and stereotyped images of reality by mass media, global extremism and terrorism, lack of knowledge, which leads to taking immature, egoistic, cultural and intercultural decisions by public opinion leaders and the masses. Lastly, artificial rising and independence movements and actions in the so-called third world countries. And a clear example for that are the so-called spring revolutions in the Arab world. Academia and civility would lead to maturity, authenticity, equality, pluralism, dialogue, and peace. The current discursive cultural and intercultural environments are being drawn by the powerful and the dominance possessors around the world. So journalism and mass media systems are their tools at most times. Most international organizations follow their leads willingly or forced. In many occasions, brands and marketing are their ways to distract the global public opinions, and they are their way to push attention economies towards consumption and entertainment away from existential and coexistential vitalities at lots of times. The way towards civility is dialogue and vice versa. So here I suggest the approach of elevating upon cultural frames, which builds on the idea of encouraging societies to exchange their cognitive perspectives in dynamics of mutual interaction, with the emphasis on maintaining their own authentic identities and adding enrichments of knowledge and experience to them. My last point I want to highlight, to keep the time, is to take the human nature and instinct into consideration, which means by realizing that human beings have common instinctive actions and reactions towards nature. By nature, we could work on developing common grounds on the cognitive, symbolic, cultural, and intercultural levels of communication by using the human abilities of logic, analysis, development, and change. Thank you. We can't hear you, Professor Basilio.
Thank you. Thank you. I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jadan. And may I request my colleague Mina Horowitz just to give us a short summary? It kind of keeping an eye on the clock as well. It's running very fast. Mina?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you on behalf of myself personally and of the Institute for International Communications, where I'm a fellow. At St. John's, we do design thinking. So anybody who has ever engaged in design thinking workshops, this is what I've been doing. Here are also some of my notes, if anybody can see. So this is a incredibly delightful, incredibly difficult task, but thank you for making it so difficult. I said to Basilio when he told me about this idea, this is impossible, we can't have this many people, this won't work as a webinar. This has been the best webinar I've attended, and I've attended many in the past half a year or so. But let me just highlight what I saw. I saw that we could approach, even from so many different angles, we could approach the question of civility from 3 different levels. And pardon my students, you know this already, where I'm coming from. We can look at the macro level, structural issues that lead to civility or incivility. And we can look at the inequalities that societies increase. We can look at the role of big tech globally and nationwide, how they shape even some local communications. Then we can look at in the macro, meso level, sorry, it's when we can look at individual organizations, individual places, stakeholders, international organizations, government, businesses. We can look at the academia, we can look at journalism and the role they play. And finally, we can look at the micro level, which is our individual standing there, our challenges, our responsibilities. And what I heard are many interesting theoretical concepts, and we could discuss those. We can also discuss a lot of problems that reach from the fact are tech neutral. Somebody has said technology is neutral, but never used neutrally. So I just leave it at that. We can talk about the issues of culture. We can talk about even silence as a part of incivility, if you like, or silencing as a part of incivility. We can look at exclusion. But what I would like to highlight at the end are the kind of solutions I gathered from everybody. And And what I heard is, first of all, the dialogue between rights and duties all the time, whether we talk about the macro level organizations or us individually. What I also heard a lot is this idea of balance and mindfulness as a guideline in all different levels. Pardon, the train is going by. What I also heard is the solution through leadership, whether we talk about leadership in terms of governments, leadership within different organizations, ranging from journalism organizations to corporations, to NGOs, and the kind of work, for instance, Lou is doing, to academia. So leadership as ours there. And of course, as Christina and I went back and forth in the chat a lot, the individual responsibility and leadership. And then finally, I think one issue was the question of trust and empathy, where when growing that is sort of the first issue or first step in creating more civil kind of communication, whether it's in the macro, meso, or micro level. And Dr. Bauer reminded us how we need to do so much more work in theorizing issues of communication or empathy in that that perspective. So finally, I'd like to finish with that yellow note that I wrote, which has, when we have these problems, they actually mirror the solutions. And even when first speakers started with the idea of thinking about reconstructing the social contract, and thinking about that we are in this sort of disruptive and challenging place like right now, and it is very unnerving and it's very scary, but at the same time, it is an opening for us to think differently. So thank you from my behalf. As you know, this is just the first brainstorming session of the, I believe, 5 more webinars to come, which Dr. Montero will invite you, and then we can focus on more deeply in the theoretical, pragmatic, and solution-oriented conversations in the future. Thank you all. Basilio, you mute your...
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We have audiences coming from India, from Brazil, from Mexico, from different parts of the world. And it is really enjoyable to hang out with you for almost 2 hours. And I hope you found the conversation productive, and wait to hear from us. We'll have one more round, few more rounds of these conversations. You just give us to get us going. Okay. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon.